So, today we're going to talk about nuclear weapons and nuclear proliferation. This is an important set of questions and topics for the course. We've already talked a little bit about how it is that nuclear weapons get used, what kinds of consequences they have for strategy, when we've talked, for example, about the work of Thomas Schelling. Now we're going to get into more depths about what nuclear weapons are, what the debates are around nuclear proliferation, and also talk a little bit about how we can think about proliferation in practice with regard to current proliferation questions, which are of great concern to US foreign policy makers. The way I'm going to do this class then is I'm going to first of all provide you with a basic introduction to what nuclear weapons are. This is pretty important if you want to understand how they are employed. If you want to understand many of the questions around proliferation, you need to have at least some rough technical background in the actual production of nuclear weapons, what kinds of systems are used to deliver them, and so on. After this, we'll talk a little bit about why it is that countries might want to acquire nuclear weapons. What is it that drives countries to want nuclear weapons? What is it that drives countries sometimes to go to very extraordinary lengths to find themselves effectively working on the black market, working against sanctions, working against the conventional nuclear regime, if you want to call it that, of treaties that suggest that states should not seek to become nuclear weapons powers. Why is it that states want to do this nonetheless? And then we will talk more specifically about the debates over nuclear proliferation. It might seem at first glance that you might think that this should be a no-brainer, that there shouldn't be a debate over nuclear proliferation, that nuclear proliferation is obviously a bad thing, and that a world without nuclear weapons would be a world, by definition, that would be better than a world with nuclear weapons, and that would seem to make sense because obviously the threat of nuclear Armageddon is a very real and very problematic one. But we will discover that there is in fact a pretty serious debate that is happening, with some people who indeed take the position that proliferation is a bad thing, but other people arguing that proliferation has some benefits and advantages. After going through this, and after describing some of the aspects of this, we will then look at specific cases to try and get a better sense of how these debates work out in practice. So first of all, we'll talk about the debate over whether Iran should acquire nuclear weapons. This has been, of course, one of the major urgent debates over the last few years in US politics, with strong disagreements between the Obama administration and the Trump administration. Then, after talking about that, we will also, in passing, we will talk about the practical application of something that I will describe in detail a little bit earlier in the lecture, which is the so-called stability-instability paradox, which really underlies a lot of the argument about Iran and nuclear weapons, which is that nuclear weapons may have stabilizing consequences in some respects, but destabilizing consequences in others, and much then depends on what you think about the on what you think about the relative trade-offs, and also about whether or not you think that states are rational or irrational. Then, after talking through this, after talking through the history of this debate, we will then move on and we'll talk about another case, which is the case of North Korea. North Korea is, of course, a case that is different in that North Korea already has acquired nuclear weapons. But this has also led to a lot of debate in the United States about what the US ought to do. And the fundamental point I think that will emerge is that there are no particularly good options. The debate is over which is the least bad option that the United States has under current circumstances. So, what are nuclear weapons? Well, we've talked about this already a fair amount in the course, and we've talked about how it is that you can think about nuclear weapons as being forms of communication, about being obviously forms of defense, about sort of having some offensive purposes, albeit sort of the offensive uses being more complicated than you might expect them to be, might perhaps have expected them before you began this course and before you began to learn about the joys and wonders of international relations. But there is another sense in which we want to potentially understand nuclear weapons, which is simply to understand how it is that they work, how it is that they're produced, and how it is that they work. So the first thing that you need to understand here, and let me be clear, I'm going to simplify all of this pretty grossly because this is not a course in nuclear engineering. This is a course in international relations. To simplify pretty grossly, the first thing you want to understand is the nuclear fuel cycle. And effectively, modern nuclear weapons can be produced in one of two ways. First of all, they can be produced directly from enriched uranium. That is from uranium in which U-235, which is the isotope of uranium that is potentially valuable, has been refined to a sufficient extent. So if you want to use uranium, obviously you can use uranium for a variety of peaceful purposes. You can use it, for example, in a nuclear reactor. And if you want to use it in a nuclear reactor, you probably want to refine it to approximately 3 to 5%. If you want instead to use your enriched uranium in an actual nuclear weapon, you want to refine it to a point where it is 90% U-235, and we will explain a little bit more how this works in the next slide. But however, there is an important second element to this, because a second way in which you can produce a nuclear weapon, and this is a far more powerful nuclear weapon, is as a side product of using a reactor, a breeder reactor for other purposes, which is that nuclear reactors produce an element that is not found in nature, at least not in the nature that we are able to mine and extract, which is plutonium. Plutonium is an element that is far better capable of being used to create a nuclear bomb, a powerful nuclear bomb, than is uranium. And so effectively, if you really want to produce an extremely powerful nuclear weapon, what you probably want to do is you want to have a nuclear reactor, which you may use to generate power for peaceful purposes, and then one of the side products of this reactor is going to be plutonium. And then you can use plutonium in its metallic form to create a pretty extraordinarily powerful core that you can then use in order to build a very, very powerful nuclear weapon. So this explains a very, very important distinction in nuclear weapons, that broadly speaking, there are two kinds of nuclear weapons that we think about. One is so-called fission weapons, or atomic bombs, to use a somewhat old-fashioned term. And these are weapons which are based upon the use of highly enriched uranium. Uranium enriched so that it is 90% U-235. And these fission weapons, they split atoms, which releases energy and potentially generates a chain reaction in the plutonium where the energy is released, and this then causes other atoms to be split, generating more energy and more energy and more energy, until you get an explosion which is roughly 10 to 15 kilotons in size. And that's a lot. That is a lot of explosive, and a fission weapon was sufficient to cause the devastation that we saw at the end of World War II in Hiroshima. The second type of nuclear weapon, however, is a so-called thermonuclear weapon, sometimes called a hydrogen bomb as opposed to an atom bomb, which is made by forcing hydrogen atoms together. And the initial precursor to this is that you use a fission explosion to compress the hydrogen, and you are capable of then creating a far more powerful explosion. In technical terms, you say that thermonuclear weapons have far greater yield than do fission weapons. So if a fission weapon, so if an average fission weapon is around 10 kilotons, then you can see from a thermonuclear weapon, you might instead have a weapon which has approximately, it could range from 100 kilotons, which is roughly 10 times as powerful as a standard fission weapon, to 10 megatons, which is approximately 1,000 times as powerful as the bomb that devastated Hiroshima. And there are other ways in which you can use to improve the yield of a nuclear weapon. There are so-called boosted nuclear weapons. There are so-called layered atomic weapons. These are ways in which you can increase the yield. But the important lesson here, I think, is more the difference between fission weapons or traditional atomic bombs and thermonuclear weapons. That is the more crucial distinction, unless you are an engineer. So this gives you a sense of how it is that the production cycle works. So here, first of all, first thing you need to do is you need to mine uranium. There are a number of places in the world where you can find uranium you can find uranium and you mine it in a very raw form. Then you take it to a specialized mill where the uranium is turned into yellowcake, which is a kind of a concentrate of uranium, but which is still completely useless. And if you try to make a nuclear bomb with yellowcake, you are not going to get particularly far. What you need to do next is you need to bring the yellowcake to a special conversion facility where the yellowcake is turned into gas, a gas called uranium hexafluoride. Why do you want to do this? Well, because the uranium consists of two isotopes. First, it consists of uranium-238, which is by far the majority of the uranium that you have, and this is completely useless. This is something where, U-238 is something that you want to get rid of. And what you're interested in is the uranium-235, which is approximately 0.7%. This is a different isotope of uranium, and it is probably 0.7% or so of the yellowcake consists of U-235, and you need somehow to separate out the uranium-235 from the uranium-238. And so how you do this, once you've turned it into a gas, you then bring the gas to a enrichment facility, which is probably going to involve centrifuges. These centrifuges spin the gas around really, really, really fast. And it turns out that one isotope is slightly heavier than the other. So this then allows you to skim off the uranium-235 in progressively purer and purer forms. So then you spin it in these centrifuges. This is an incredibly tricky process to get right. The centrifuges have to spin extremely fast. They have to be extremely high tolerance. Building them requires a lot of engineering know-how, but once you have it, you just keep on spinning again and again and again and again and again, skimming off the richer part of the uranium. And this then allows you in successive stages to enrich it to different levels. If you spin it up to approximately 3 to 5%, you can then use it to turn it into reactor fuel. This is the stage at which you can use it in a nuclear reactor. If you keep on spinning it again and again until it gets from 3 to 5% to 20% to 50% and then perhaps to 90%, you then, once you've gotten to 90%, you can then take one of the routes to producing a nuclear warhead. You then, once you have enough enriched uranium at 90%, you can then build a weapons core with it. You then, once you have the core, you bring it to you assemble it into a warhead, which effectively is a device which is designed to compress or use a gun type device to basically squeeze and compress the uranium, and then once you have that warhead, you figure out a delivery system, and the warhead plus the delivery system allow you to actually create a nuclear weapon. However, the second way in which you can do this is if you just take the 3 to 5% processed uranium, so the not weapons grade uranium, and then you put it into a nuclear reactor. You turn it into uranium fuel rods, and you use these to generate power in a reactor. Once the fuel rods have generated power, they are spent. And part of the spent fuel rods is plutonium, which you can think about as being, it has some medical uses. You can also think about it as being a dangerous byproduct that you want to get rid of by burying deep beneath a mountain. Or alternatively, if you are very careful and if you're capable of separating the plutonium out, you can then turn it, as we have discussed, into a far, far more effective nuclear weapon. You can use the metallic plutonium to create a far more powerful core, and then you then assemble the warhead, you assemble the delivery system, and then you have a much more powerful bomb than you would if you use pure uranium. And this is part of the problem that generates the whole system for oversight of a peaceful civilian use of nuclear energy. Part of the problem is that, especially if you use so-called heavy water reactors, you are capable of producing, plutonium more or less gets generated inevitably as a byproduct, and then you have to have complicated systems if you want to make of oversight, if you want to make sure that states aren't sneaking away their spent fuel rods and using them to produce incredibly powerful nuclear weapons. And so this is part of the nuclear oversight regime, is that it's very, very hard to separate out completely the peaceful production of nuclear energy from the production of nuclear weapons. The two, in a certain sense, they go hand in hand together. It is relatively straightforward once you have gotten to the stage of being a peaceful nuclear energy power to then become a nuclear weapons power pretty straightforwardly, and this generates a lot of problems and a lot of oversight to try and make sure that states do not suddenly decide to go nuclear by having a sneaky backroom arrangements of one sort or another. So this explains how it is that nuclear weapons can be produced. How is it that they are delivered? Here, the standard story that we have is that if you bear with me, is that in the United States we talk about three major different delivery systems that you could imagine. One is the first system that was, of course, used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which is to have an airplane which acts as a bomber. And the United States has a variety of planes that are specialized in carrying nuclear weapons, and then from high altitude sending off a bomb which can then create a devastating explosion. So this is the first element of the nuclear triad. And the benefit of bombers is that they have a high degree of tactical maneuverability. You can effectively decide if you have made a mistake, if you send the bombers out, you can withdraw them pretty quickly. You can send a phone message to you can radio or otherwise communicate with the crews of the bombers, and you can tell them that the mission needs to be aborted, that something is different from what they expected. So the weakness, however, is that these bombers are vulnerable to interception. If you want to defend yourself against bombers, you can have anti-aircraft systems, you can have fighter jets, you can have other systems that can be used to effectively to prevent bombers from getting close enough to your capital city or your other facility that you want to guard. So the disadvantage of bombers is that it is possible that your adversary, if you use them, your adversary may be able to stop them. This is not really the case with ICBMs or intercontinental ballistic missiles. These are the second element of the triad. And these are missiles which go into they go effectively into the low Earth orbit region, and then they come back again at thousands of miles an hour, making them incredibly difficult to intercept. There have been various schemes which have been discussed of trying to build systems to block ICBMs, to use some sort of automated systems, that hover in space that would effectively perhaps be fast enough to stop some ICBMs, but they have never been deployed at scale because this would have all sorts of destabilizing consequences potentially for the armed peace during the Cold War. The benefits of ICBMs are that they are very, very reliable. If you once you send the order to launch an ICBM, you can be pretty sure that that ICBM is probably going to get to its target. And you can also have integrated command and control systems. It is because they are land-based. It is going to be and because they are based in, because there are extensive communication systems, you can keep control of your ICBMs even in chaotic wartime situations, so that you can make sure that they are not, for example, launched by accident. One of the weaknesses, however, is that they tend to have fixed targets. It isn't possible at the last moment to decide that you want to deploy your ICBMs against target B rather than target A. That takes a lot of work. The final important element of the nuclear triad is SLBMs, or submarine-launched ballistic missiles. And these play a crucial role because effectively what they provide is what might be described as second strike capability. So imagine that there is a nuclear war, and this gets back to deterrence theory. Imagine that there is a nuclear war in which one side is capable of mounting a surprise attack on the other. It is capable of using ICBMs to take out not only the other's capital cities and command centers, but also to take out the other country's ICBMs, so that the other country never gets a chance to retaliate. And it's possible to do this because it's probably possible with satellite photos and with other means to have, with some degree of likelihood, some understanding of where these systems are going to be based. Now, then at that point, that is the point when SLBMs come into their own, because SLBMs allow for an enemy that has been sneak attacked, allows for the actor who has been attacked by surprise, they allow it to retaliate, because it is extremely difficult to locate submarines, the submarines that are holding the ballistic missiles. They can be, they are deep beneath the sea. They are very, very hard to keep tracked. And so it could well be that it then becomes that then the SLBMs, they can have instructions that under certain circumstances they are to launch, and then they are able to retaliate. Now, the point of this is deterrence, that when you have SLBMs, when you have the second strike capability, it means that deterrence is likely to be more effective, because an adversary, even if the adversary can be reasonably sure that they can get most or all of your land-based systems, they will not be able to get your submarine-based systems, and hence your adversary will look forward and realize that you are going to be capable potentially of taking a devastating action against them in retaliation. That the commanders of the submarines, they will look at their charred and radioactive homeland, and they will decide that they are going to obey their orders and take action. And this will then mean that they then, perhaps their missiles are launched against your capital cities, or launched against other things that you really value. You will look ahead and you will look down the tree of possible actions, and you will realize that the punishment that will be exerted against you is a credible punishment, because these SLBMs are going to be impossible for you to eliminate, and therefore you will not engage in an attack in the first place. Now, obviously, the disadvantage of SLBMs is that there's going to be poor command and control. In order to keep evading the enemy so that the enemy can't find them, SLBMs, the submarines that hold the SLBMs, do not communicate very often with their commanding, with the command and control center, because this would potentially betray their location. And in the most plausible circumstance in which SLBMs would be important, that is after a nuclear exchange had already taken place, there probably wouldn't be any sort of very reasonable way of them talking to command and control if command and control still existed after a surprise nuclear attack. And so under those circumstances, you might expect to see the submarine commanders taking their own decisions, and this could have potentially, this could lead to a lot of potential unpredictability. And indeed, we have seen one moment during the Cuban Missile Crisis where these kinds of poor command and control things very nearly led to a nuclear war, effectively a possible nuclear war. Effectively, what happened was that a Russian nuclear-armed submarine found itself being potentially attacked by the United States. And the orders which were given to its commanding officer effectively suggested that under those circumstances it should launch its missiles. And the commander in question decided effectively to breach those orders and was backed up by one of his junior officers. To launch required a majority of 2 of the 3 officers with command authority on the vessel, and 2 of the commanding officers decided against this. But had that one other person voted the other way, we could have been in a situation where missiles would have been launched against the United States, and the United States could plausibly have retaliated. And the reason why this was so was that the officers in question, they were on a submarine, they were incapable of communicating with their command and control back in Russia, and so they had to make the decision on their own. And so we can see how this could be, this very nearly had devastating consequences in the past. There are possible future circumstances in which it could be similarly. This then brings us on to a question, which is nuclear weapons. Why do states acquire them or not acquire them? What are the key things that are behind their decisions over whether or not to acquire nuclear weapons? Because we live in a world which is somewhat puzzling from that perspective, in that there are a number of nuclear powers, but also there are a number of countries, and here you might think about Germany, you might think about Japan, you might think about Sweden, which have not acquired nuclear weapons, even though they possibly could have acquired. So what drives some states rather than others to acquire nuclear weapons? First thing you might want to think about is geopolitical goals. And this is a standard realist argument in a sense, that you might think about this from a defensive realist perspective, is that nuclear weapons provide you with a lot of security. If you are a nuclear power, nobody wants to attack you, and because they fear that they will suffer a devastating nuclear retaliation if they attack you. And if you are a security seeker, as Wallsian realists expect that states are, this is a pretty great thing to have. So then from a Wallsian perspective, this provides you with security. And one of the interesting puzzles from a Wallsian perspective is why it is that some states that might want to have the security have opted against nuclear weapons. However, you can also think about nuclear weapons from an offensive perspective. Even if you don't want to use nuclear weapons offensively, you could perhaps engage in expansion of your territory. You could coerce other states using nuclear weapons, or else using more conventional weapons for expansion and coercion, knowing that other states were not willing to challenge you, especially if those other states are not themselves nuclear powers and do not have the backing and support of a nuclear power. But the reasons why states might acquire nuclear weapons don't necessarily have to do simply with the standard things that realists talk about, such as security and the desire to perhaps expand your control in order to acquire security in an offensive realist framework. They also might involve constructivist things. So there might be important things about norms and identities here, so that you can think about different norms potentially encouraging or discouraging proliferation. And this might help explain why it is that some states want and some states do not want to have nuclear weapons. Because it could be that you could see how norms and status might drive you to want to become a nuclear power. if you're a nuclear power, other states may treat you more seriously. You have a gravitas, you have a weight, you have suddenly become potentially one of the big players in the world. And in other words, you have major power status. And states are sometimes driven by status considerations. They care about the status that they have in the eyes of other states. They care about being able to make other states quake in fear when they do stuff. They care about being invited into the secretive discussions where the great powers decide effectively how to deal with the world. And so this is a normative reason, a kind of constructivist reason why it is that states might want to acquire nuclear weapons. But you also might imagine that there are constructivist reasons why states might not want to acquire nuclear weapons, and this has to do with the whole variety of norms around the non-proliferation treaties, which suggest that you should not acquire nuclear weapons, that nuclear weapon status is bad, and that you should only pursue peaceful uses of nuclear power. So there is a danger and a risk that you might be treated as a pariah by other states, be treated as a norm breaker, be treated as a state that other states didn't want to have anything to do with, and this again could drive you in that direction. There are also potential domestic political reasons why it is that you might want to have nuclear weapons. It could be that this is something that you want to do in order to try to impress your domestic public, to tell your domestic public that you have acquired this, this technological status, that you are capable of protecting your people, that you have arrived at the table for the big powers. All of these things can not only be international, driven by norms and identities of the state, they can be driven by domestic politics too, and it could be that one party decides, and there are examples of this, that one party decides that getting nuclear weapons could provide advantage in a domestic political contest. Also, international influence and bargaining. It could be that you want to have more ability to bargain, more clout with other states, and here you can plausibly argue that North Korea in part is driven by this. It may be driven in part by security considerations, by the realization that it is not a particularly popular state, that the United States in particular is implacably opposed to it, and that nuclear weapons provide it with a greater degree of security. It may also perhaps want to use nuclear weapons as a bargaining chip, as a means of acquiring concessions from other states that it feels that it would not be capable of acquiring without nuclear weapons. And now, which of these things drives the behavior of states has important consequences for non-proliferation policy, because you can imagine that different causes would lead you to behave in different ways. To take an obvious example, and we will talk a little bit more about this towards the end, if you're looking at North Korea, do you think that North Korea is driven by internal reasons of trying to provide for its own security by ensuring that other states aren't willing to attack it? Or do you think that North Korea is acquiring nuclear weapons as a simple bargaining ploy vis-a-vis other states? Depending on this theory, and there have been evidence at different points in time for both of these theories of North Korea's behavior, you might adopt a different kind of a strategy towards North Korea. If you think that it is willing to give up its nuclear program for concessions, you might behave in one way. If you think that it is fundamentally going to be unwilling to give up its nuclear program because it sees its nuclear program as a key thing that prevents it from being attacked by other states, then you might instead seek to contain North Korea in some way or another, and recognize that it is probably going to be impossible to get North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons. This leads into nuclear proliferation. So, fundamental question here. Is nuclear proliferation, that is the spread of nuclear weapons to new countries, is this a bad thing? And this is something where the conventional wisdom would suggest that yes, it is a bad thing. It is a very bad thing. We have a non-proliferation treaty. We have all of these other instruments, all of these other norms, which all are directed at telling us how bad and dreadful nuclear proliferation can be. And you can think about very obvious reasons why it's bad. Nuclear weapons can inflict massive damage. there is a high risk of nuclear war. Nuclear war, even a limited nuclear war, would probably have devastating consequences. If it becomes an all-out nuclear war, even with the limited number of warheads that we have today as compared to 20 or 30 years ago, this could have ferocious consequences for the world as a whole, including for states which had nothing to do with the war in question, but find themselves effectively having to deal with nuclear fallout, nuclear winter, all sorts of really horrible stuff on the side. And there also is, sort of whenever you have nuclear weapons, there is a risk of accidents happening that could go very, very bad. As I mentioned, it could be that it could be that things depend upon command decisions given imperfect information. So we had another infamous incident where it looked on United States computers, thanks to a bug, it looked on United States computers as if there was a sudden launch of ICBMs. There were tons of ICBMs coming in from the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and then decision makers, so they saw what appeared to be a major nuclear attack, and they had to decide on the spur of the moment, did they retaliate while they had time, and they literally had minutes to make this decision, or did they not retaliate in the hope that this was just some kind of a technical error? They decided not to retaliate, but you can see how it could very easily have gone the other way. And if they had retaliated, the Soviet Union would have retaliated in turn, and things could have gone absolutely awfully very, very quickly, thanks to the fact that these technologies sometimes don't work all that well. So there's a very obvious set of reasons why we don't want to have nuclear weapons. But there also are many people who think that nuclear weapons have benefits, have broad benefits for the world. This includes many realists, and we will describe how it is that realist theory supports this set of assumptions under some conditions. And also we can see how certain people, certain kinds of people in the grand strategy community, certain kinds of grand strategies might also suggest that nuclear weapons are a good thing. So if, for example, you are a neo-isolationist, you might be in favor of nuclear proliferation, especially to US allies such as Japan and South Korea. And the argument here would be fairly straightforward, and this indeed is an argument that Trump has made at some points, which is that if Japan and South Korea had nuclear weapons, then China would not want to attack them, and then the United States would not have to go to the expense and trouble of defending them anymore. And it turns out, in fact, that the United States policy towards nuclear proliferation is pretty unclear. And we saw that when a number of years ago, the Non-Proliferation Treaty was renegotiated. Because in its original form, the Non-Proliferation Treaty effectively had a commitment to moving to a world without nuclear weapons. In the revision of that treaty, that was heavily watered down. And it's quite clear that the United States does not want to move to a world without nuclear weapons. It sees nuclear weapons and its possession of nuclear weapons as being an important part of a US core defense strategy. And furthermore, the United States has different attitudes to different states when it comes to nuclear proliferation. So that, for example, we can see how the United States, when India and Pakistan went nuclear, the United States reacted with moderate, with real disapproval and with moderate measures, but was prepared pretty quickly to move to normal relations and to accepting this as the status quo. When other states such as Iran and before it North Korea threatened to go nuclear, the United States adopts a very, very, very different attitude. Let's talk a little bit more about the plausible case for nuclear proliferation. And here we see this case being made in the Waltz reading. And it's very straightforward. The ideas that drive Waltz are pretty clear, that nuclear proliferation can have some important benefits. And the benefits are that according to Waltz and according to realists like Waltz, who believe that the security dilemma is what drives state behavior, In a world with nuclear weapons, we are likely to see greater peace. And it's pretty clear why this is so. If you are a nuclear power, nobody is going to want to fight you. Nobody is going to care to fight you because they are going to worry that you might use nuclear weapons against them. And so this then means that nuclear weapons, if you possess them, that they eliminate the security dilemma for you. You can think about nuclear weapons as being a kind of internal balancing. That is that if you are a great power who has nuclear weapons, you don't have to engage in these complicated alliances to nearly the same degree anymore. You can rely on your own internal forces as a means of balancing against a potential adversary and as a means of securing yourself against most potential adversaries that you might imagine. So the key logic behind this is very, very straightforward. Waltz and people like Waltz believe that the fundamental thing that is driving state behavior is insecurity, is the fear that other states might take advantage of you and might use that advantage in order to effectively drive you out of existence, to conquer you in one way or another. And if you have nuclear weapons, you no longer have that existential fear driving every move that you make in the international arena. You can afford to relax. And this then suggests that some degree of nuclear, of controlled proliferation can create peace and stability. That the more that you have proliferation among powers, albeit the realists do acknowledge that there is greater uncertainty that goes together with proliferation, that perhaps the balancing act that states have to think about becomes more complicated the more powers there are, but that some degree of nuclear proliferation can have benefits. And they especially tend to think that nuclear proliferation has benefits when it is combined with bipolarity. And the idea here is that the best kind of world, the most stable kind of world, is a world in which there are two great powers confronting each other and balancing against each other, because this is a world in which those powers, so when they have nuclear weapons preserve them from the fundamental fear that they might otherwise have, that they're going to find themselves being conquered or being otherwise disadvantaged. And bipolarity, the organization of alliances around these great nuclear powers, means that the world becomes relatively straightforward and relatively predictable, and that accidents and miscalculations are much less likely to happen. So from the perspective of Waltzian realists, the most stable kind of world you can imagine is a world where there is a bipolar confrontation, and that is combined with nuclear weapons. This is something which explains why many of these realists were, in a sense, actively nostalgic for the Cold War, because they thought that the Cold War was a pretty good thing in many ways, that it created a lot of stability, that you did not see the kinds of great power wars that you had seen in World War I or World War II, that risk of conflagration had more or less disappeared, and that this was a very, very, very good thing for the world. And there is some logic to that set of claims, very obviously. If your major concern is to try and prevent world wars of the kinds that had devastated the world, or perhaps even major regional wars, then the proliferation of nuclear weapons can help you to prevent that. So, this was not just defensive realists, it also was an argument which was made sometimes, albeit with a greater degree of hesitation to some extent, by offensive realists too. And we see this, for example, in an article that has not been assigned for this semester, but which is an interesting article to look up if you're interested in these questions, which is John Mearsheimer's article, Back to the Future, which was written in the 1990s, more or less immediately after the end of the Cold War. And so this helps us to understand why it is that many realists saw the Cold War as being a good thing. Because Mearsheimer's prediction was that the end of the Cold War was going to be completely disastrous for Western Europe. He saw Western Europe as effectively having been held together by the bipolar system, and by the US alliances. And so he said that in a world without that kind of bipolar system of the Cold War, we were likely to see much greater instability happening within Western Europe again, and in particular we were likely to see an increased risk of confrontation between powers such as West Germany, as it was then it became united, and France, that these powers were likely to start maneuvering again against each other, as they had in the run-up to World War I and World War II, with the United Kingdom perhaps acting as a kind of trying to keep the peace, trying to balance some sort of from offshore, but that this was going to be a messy situation, which was likely to lead back into the kinds of instability that we had seen, which had led to World War I and World War II. So Mearsheimer's prediction, which made perfect sense from an offensive realist perspective, is that that we would now see Germany and France struggle for hegemony in Europe, that the United States would withdraw because it no longer had any great interest in Western Europe now that the Soviet threat had been vanquished. And so Germany and France would begin to struggle for domination because this was the only way that they could secure themselves, thanks to the tragedy of great power politics, and that all sorts of bad things would happen as other states got sucked into the maelstrom. Mearsheimer's recommendation as a kind of a cure for this was limited nuclear proliferation. That if we saw states such as Germany acquiring the bomb, that this would then mean that we still would see much greater instability than we might have seen during the Cold War, but nonetheless that this instability could be managed because nuclear powers would be less likely to go to war with each other. Now, of course, we're now living approximately 26, 27 years later, I can't remember the exact date, and we have not seen the world that Mearsheimer predicted come into being, but nonetheless, this gives you a pretty good idea of how the logic plays out and why it is that even offensive realists believe that nuclear weapons can have an important stabilizing benefit. So that is the case for nuclear weapons and for nuclear proliferation under some circumstances, that it stabilizes the world. It makes war less likely because, on a grand scale, when this might pull in nuclear powers who might then pull in nuclear weapons because nobody wants to get involved in a nuclear war. The case against is made in the Sagan reading. And the Sagan reading more or less suggests that these claims for stability are grossly overblown. And they're grossly overblown because they fail to pay attention to crucial characteristics of how military decisions are actually taken. And so Sagan argues that we need to pay attention to how militaries are organized and to thinking about militaries as bureaucracies. Because if you think about, for example, a Ministry for Health is devoted by and large to the notion that health is a good and wonderful thing, and that we need to do everything we can in order to ensure healthy citizens. A ministry or a department of the Department of State is obviously committed to the awesomeness of diplomacy, and so on and so on and so on. So that if you disaggregate the state in this way, you can see how the state is made up of a bundle of specialized organizations, call them ministries, call them departments, call them whatever you want, each of which has a particular goal. And if you look at the military, which is organized obviously in the Pentagon under the Department of Defense, you will see that the goal of the military is to think about war, to think about the circumstances under which war will happen, to think about plans for making war, to think about contingencies for what happens if other states attack, and so on and so on. And the fundamental goal of the military is to make sure that in the case that war happens, that a victory is won, that the defense forces or the army or the navy or whatever, that they all come together and that they win a war. So that is the fundamental bureaucratic imperative according to Sagan, and of course other people might disagree with this to some degree. This is the fundamental imperative according to Sagan that drives military decision making and drives the military, is thinking about how to win the war. And furthermore, expecting that war is going to be inevitable at some point or another, thinking about war as being something that you simply cannot escape from, thinking about war as being something that is fundamentally part and parcel of the world that we live in. This then, according to Sagan, has consequences. First of all, it means that the military, if it's devoted to thinking about war, it doesn't think so much about the broader context that war comes in. It doesn't think about what kinds of things you might have to do, might have to live with if a war actually took place. It doesn't think about the post-war disasters that people have to deal with. This simply isn't part of the military's job. The military thinks about this according to Sagan. Again, some people might disagree. But in Sagan's argument, the military simply thinks about its job as being, we will win the war, and then we will let the civilians think about the other stuff, because that is not our business to think about. And this then means that the military's understanding of war, including nuclear war, is perhaps different than that of civilian administrators. They are likely to think that war, including preventative nuclear war, that is using nuclear weapons in order to prevent some major dire threat, that this is something which is an acceptable and appropriate thing to think about, and not only to think about, but to plan for and to set in motion contingency arrangements or whatever, and perhaps in certain circumstances to contemplate. So Sagan provides a history of the Eisenhower administration, in which he suggests that it's pretty clear that at some points the military strongly wanted to use nuclear weapons, and he talks about how various sort of senior military officials, including, for example, Curtis LeMay Jr., who was a pretty famous general in the Air Force general in the Vietnam War, how they wanted to deploy nuclear weapons in order to win. So this, according to Sagan, suggests that the standard realist account, which suggests that nobody rational would want to really go to war for offensive purposes using nuclear weapons, turns out to be more complicated than it looks, because we know that military decision makers very often would indeed like to go to war, or, well, like is putting it too strongly, but at least would view war as being a nuclear war as being an acceptable choice to make, given certain other factors, including using them in a preventative fashion rather than using nuclear weapons as a retaliatory thing in the context of some kind of a deterrent strategy. Also, Sagan says this is likely to be more of a problem for some states than for others, because Sagan's fundamental argument here is that he believes that the military is more likely to be in favor of nuclear war for some reasons than is the civilian powers. Civilian powers have a different set of priorities, have a different set of beliefs, and are probably likely to be less war prone. So then we can say that there are two kinds of a state that are more likely to actually get involved in a nuclear war than are other states, than are more democratic states. The first is that we can expect that military dictatorships of one sort or another are plausibly going to be more likely to contemplate a nuclear war than are non-military dictatorships, for obvious reasons. If the military is effectively in charge of the state, if the military is taking the decisions, then Sagan's logic would suggest that this means that they are going to see fewer possible barriers to going to war. There's nobody in charge of the military to tell them not to, because the military more or less is in charge itself. The second kind of state that you could see being more likely to go to war is a state in which there is a civilian administration, but the civilian administration has questionable control of the military. And here we see this having happened, for example, in Pakistan, that Bhutto, who was a leader of Pakistan, it was clear that the military was behaving in ways that were semi-autonomous. And we can also imagine how when we have countries where the military is stronger, where the military is potentially capable of mounting a coup, that the civilian authorities, when they look to try and build relationships with the military, their major concern may not be sort of whether the officer in question is more trustworthy when it comes to nuclear stuff, whether the officer is is competent. Their major concern may be, is the officer in question loyal to the regime? And this then can lead to, again, war becoming more likely. And also, and this is an important point, also accidents becoming more likely. So Sagan suggests that if we think about the nuclear war machine, it is what he calls a tightly coupled system. A tightly coupled system is a term for is a technical term for a system where everything is so tightly connected to everything else that if one thing goes wrong, there's a high possibility that other things are going to go wrong too, so that disaster might occur. And so Sagan suggests that we have a world in which, if we look at militaries, if we look at command and control systems, these look like beautifully functioning systems if you read the propaganda. But from Sagan's perspective, it turns out that these systems are often messier and more traumatic than we understand them to be, and that they very often have near misses. There are situations in which bombs get dropped by accident in the United States. There are situations where nuclear weapons go missing. That if you want to understand how it is that these systems actually work, you should not look to you shouldn't look to the manuals. Instead, you should look to the kind of parody comedies of the military or parody comedies of administration to understand how messy and how screwed up things can actually get, because people are flawed people, and when they are dealing with an extremely complicated system in which doing the wrong thing can have major ramifications, can lead to repercussions which reverberate, so that small mistakes can lead to big dysfunctions, then you want to be very careful. And here, so if you want, the standard example that people offer of a tightly coupled system was the U.S. space shuttle, which was taken out of commission when it turned out that effectively a specific set of rings sort of had degraded, leading to a knock-on set of accidents and problems, which resulted in the space shuttle exploding shortly after launch, killing 7 astronauts and a teacher who had been launched who had gone up into space at the same time. This is an example of a tightly coupled system where if one small thing goes wrong, then the entire system can blow up. And Sagan worries that the U.S. military system or not the U.S. military, but military systems in general for controlling nuclear weapons may be much more tightly coupled, much more vulnerable to this kind of cascading catastrophe than the guidebook. There is obviously also, there's a different case, which is a more limited case, not for simply for not getting rid of nuclear weapons altogether. And this is made by Schelling. So Schelling isn't making a very strong positive argument for proliferation. He's not saying that we should have more proliferation. He's instead saying that the goal, which has been stated by many non-proliferation people, that we should move to a world of zero nuclear weapons, that this would be a mistake. And his argument is very, very straightforward. It's a more limited, more specific argument than the realist argument of Waltz and Mearsheimer, although it does have a few things in common with it. And it suggests that once we have discovered nuclear weapons, we cannot undiscover them. We cannot put the genie back into the bottle. So that, say, for example, imagine a world in which everybody suddenly agrees to a much more powerful version of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, in which states agree to get rid of their nuclear weapons over a period of a few years. So they all agree. They agree to inspection regimes. They agree to turn their nuclear warheads into, to either dump them or to use the fissile material for other purposes. If we're in that world, according to Schelling, we're in a world where states may get rid of the materials, but where they still are going to continue to know how to make nuclear weapons, and also where, even if states have promised to get rid of the stuff that they need for nuclear weapons, they may not entirely be trustworthy on this, and where even if they are trustworthy, they can probably put together the materials for a nuclear bomb again pretty right quick. So this then means that we would move to a world in which there might be in principle no nuclear weapons, but where in practice it might be possible for states to move to producing nuclear weapons very, very quickly within a period even of weeks or months if they have the sufficient know-how, if they have access to the appropriate materials. It is not hard to build up at least basic nuclear weapons very quickly and very straightforwardly again. So then that suggests, according to Schelling, that if we are in this world, it is going to be a world which plausibly is going to be more unstable than the world we are in at the moment. Because from Schelling's perspective, nuclear weapons provide a lot of stability. They provide a certain amount of predictability. We have rules. We have a system that, as Schelling describes it, he describes how this is not perfect, how there are various gaps in our shared understandings, but nonetheless we have these shared understandings around nuclear weapons which lead to a relatively high degree of stability in our relationships around them. This would all disappear, according to Schelling, in a world in which we had no nuclear weapons. We would instead be in a world where nobody was quite sure what the rules were, and where there might be temptations to engage in various actions that might lead to miscalculation. So you might, for example, decide that since France has gotten rid of its nuclear weapons, perhaps some sort of Germany does decide to be bad and evil. Obviously, this is a ridiculous hypothetical, but Germany decides to be bad and evil and to send the Wehrmacht across the Rhine and to invade France in a sneak attack. But what Germany does not realize is that in the period that it would take in order to penetrate to Paris, that France is going to be able to generate nuclear bombs again and might deploy those nuclear weapons against Berlin. So we are in a world where states might make might make miscalculations more easily because they would have less knowledge about what other states were or were not capable of doing. They might not have the same kind of knowledge about states' access to fissile material, states' access to engineering capabilities, and so on. And so they might make miscalculations which might make, paradoxically, a nuclear war more likely to happen in a world without nuclear weapons, at least as an end stage, than in a world with them, because states would be able to relatively quickly recreate those nuclear weapons, and because the higher degree of instability in that world might lead to a greater temptation to engage in confrontations, which might spiral out of control very quickly. We think about this all a little bit more abstractly, which is to say that if we look at these three different ways of thinking about nuclear weapons, we will see that there are theoretical arguments that lie behind them. Behind Waltz's argument, very unsurprisingly, is a standard realist argument. For Waltz, states are all the same. States all are motivated, at least they're the same in their motivations. They're all motivated by the fundamental fears that surround the security dilemma and that surround the likelihood that other states might seek to attack them. So they are worried about their own security. They are security seekers. And furthermore, Waltz assumes that states are going to be rational in how they seek to defend their security. And so this suggests, to the extent that this is true, that we can focus on the systemic level, the level of war, and we can also assume that states are not going to behave in stupid and self-destructive ways, that states are going to recognize that nuclear weapons, that engaging in nuclear confrontation is a bad idea, and that since states recognize that engaging in nuclear confrontation is a bad idea, the critical consequence of nuclear weapons is that it is going to make states feel safer, they're going to be less likely to be attacked, but that states are never going to deploy nuclear weapons because they are rational and because they realize that going to war with nuclear weapons would be in nobody's interest. So then some degree of proliferation, according to Waltz, especially when it goes together with bipolarity, is going to be a good and valuable thing. So Sagan, in contrast, he makes an argument which is not focused on the level of the system. He makes an argument which is focused on two other levels. One is the level of bureaucracy, which is described by people like Jervis, and the other is the level of the state. That is, the argument that he makes is, in contrary to Waltz, that some states are going to be different than others, and with a strong implication that proliferation to those to states which are unusually risky is a bad idea and is a much worse idea than proliferation to more stable states. And so here the fundamental question that he is posing, or the fundamental point he is posing, is that he thinks that states that are military-led regimes are going to be more dangerous if they have nuclear weapons than states where there is strong civilian control. That is not to say that states with strong civilian control will completely get rid of the risk. He suggests that it is also a good idea for states with strong civilian control, if they are great powers, to begin to limit their arsenals to make it less likely that mistakes will happen and make those mistakes less problematic if they do happen. But he at least believes that civilian states are less likely to use nuclear weapons than are military-led states. So this is very different from a Waltzian perspective. It suggests that states are going to have different goals, different understandings of nuclear weapons, depending upon whether they are military dictatorships or whether they are peaceful civilian-led states. Furthermore, he argues, and he bases this argument about the differences in the argument that bureaucracies, different parts of the state, are going to have different motivations, and in particular, the military parts of the state, the Pentagon in the United States, is going to think about nuclear weapons differently than is the civilian part, and this then means that states are not necessarily going to be rational. I'm sorry, I just said relevant. That should be rational. States are not necessarily going to be rational in Waltz's sense of the word rational. That is, that they aren't simply going to think about things looking at the systemic position that they are in. Instead, they are going to be guided by particular bureaucratic imperatives, such that some parts of the state are liable to think collectively in other parts of the state, and then this explains why it is that some states are different as a whole than other states. Those states in which the bureaucracy that is controlling is a military bureaucracy are going to have a different approach to nuclear weapons, and from Waltz's perspective, a less rational approach to nuclear weapons than are states which are controlled by the civilian part. Finally, we have Schelling. And Schelling, as his theory befits him, is primarily interested in the informational aspects of nuclear weapons. He believes that nuclear weapons have turned out to be valuable because we know what to do with them. Because we have worked out, and this is the logic behind many of his claims, we have worked out how to communicate with threats and counter threats using nuclear weapons. And so hence, we in a sense have turned nuclear weapons into a kind of language that helps us to create stability, that helps us to create common expectations among each other. And if we were to move to a different language, if we were to abandon the language that we use to make sense of the world, we would be much more likely to make communicative mistakes with each other, and this can have consequences when those communicative mistakes might. Let's talk about how these ideas apply in practice, and talk in particular about one of the most important questions about US proliferation policy, one of the clear threats that the United States has been worried about, which is Iran and the Iranian nuclear program. So the United States has not liked Iran for a long period of time. This has a lot to do with US-Iranian history. More or less, if you go back in time, you'll see that the United States effectively supported a dictatorship, an effective dictatorship, the Shah of Iran, who was in charge of an exceptionally cruel security service. The United States was effectively also supported a coup to topple a civilian regime in Iran when it saw that regime as acting against its interests. And Iran, in turn, when the revolution happened in Iran, Iran held many US diplomats hostage, contrary to international law. So effectively, we live in a world where the United States and Iran have constructed each other, if you want to think about this from a constructivist perspective, as being hostile powers, as being enemies to each other. And this has shaped US policy to Iran for a long period of time. Furthermore, Iran over the last 20 to 30 years has been curious about, and then eventually engaged actively in developing a nuclear program. This is something that the United States has been especially concerned about because Israel is a major US ally in the region, and because Israel would be particularly vulnerable to a potential Iranian attack. So, Iranian nuclear program has been a major source of worry and stress for the United States, and perhaps has been one of the most significant proliferation question over the last several years for the United States, especially after North Korea did create a nuclear bomb of its own. The most significant question for the United States has been in proliferation whether Iran might go nuclear as well, and what the consequences might be. And also the United States has wanted to make sure that it did not see a regional war being provoked in a situation where it appeared that Iran was about to acquire nuclear weapons and Israel attacked Iran, perhaps some sort of sparking off a broader war in which different countries in the region took sides. So the Iranian nuclear program centered around the development of uranium enrichment capabilities at two known sites, Natanz and Fordow. Fordow was set up to enrich uranium to 20%. Now, remember that this is much richer than is needed for most standard civilian uses for uranium, which have to do with the generation of power, where you only need uranium to be enriched to a level of 3 to 5%. And furthermore, once you have reached 20%, once you've gotten uranium up to 20% enrichment, it then does not take all that much further enrichment in terms of cycles in the centrifuges in order to get it up to weapons grade. Now, this was something which presented a big dilemma for Israel, as mentioned, and Israel had in the past sought to prevent other powers in the region from acquiring nuclear capabilities. When Iraq sought to build up an enrichment facility at Osirak, Israel effectively went in and destroyed Osirak with a set of surprised airstrikes. However, Fordow was set up deep within a mountain. It's impossible, or well, perhaps not impossible, people disagree, but at the very least very difficult to destroy Fordow using airstrikes. It's too deeply buried within rock to be readily destroyed using conventional weapons, using conventional bombs. So this meant that the Osirak option wasn't open. As Iran continued to build and to enrich uranium, it became clear that Iran was getting closer to breakout capability, to the ability to build a bomb from the uranium that had already enriched to 20%. People disagreed. Some people claimed that it could be as short as 2 months. Other people said 6 months. Other people said longer. But everybody agreed that Iran was in a position where it could, in a reasonably short period of time, although they disagreed about how short that period of time was, it could, in a reasonably short period of time, get to a point where it could actually build a nuclear weapon. So, the other thing that concerned people was that Iran also developed a heavy water reactor at Arak, which is a particular kind of reactor which could produce weapons-grade plutonium relatively straightforwardly. Iran denied that it was looking to produce this plutonium for use in nuclear weapons, claiming that it wanted this plutonium for medical uses, and plutonium indeed does have some medical uses. However, there was some skepticism about these claims because typically when you have a plant for medical uses, you don't surround it with heavy and anti-aircraft batteries and the like. So Iran more generally denied that its nuclear program was for producing weapons, but many countries in the rest of the world, including the United States and Israel, but also the European Union, believed otherwise. They believed that Iran, despite its disclaimers, despite its statements that it did not want to become a nuclear power, was in fact looking to do this. And the United States and Israel engaged in cyber sabotage of the Iranian enrichment facilities, the so-called Olympic Games program, which we will describe when we get to the week on cybersecurity, in order to try and put back Iran's ability to produce enough weapons-grade uranium. And also the United States and the European Union began to introduce increasingly severe sanctions starting in 2012 during the Obama administration, which sought to use the weaponized interdependence that we have discussed in a previous class, sought to use these in order to cut Iran out of the international economy. And there was a variety of secondary sanctions that effectively sought to cut out banks, to require other countries, businesses in other countries, not to import oil from Iran, or else they would suffer exclusion from the international banking system. They would suffer penalties which could mount up to billions of dollars. So, this was the Iranian nuclear program, and this is why the Iranian nuclear program caused a lot of well, first of all, it could try to opt for sabotage. It could try to sabotage the facilities. It did indeed try to do this, and it bought some time. There are some disagreements about how much time, but it only bought a little amount of time. It was clear that this could delay the production, but it probably wasn't enough to stop it completely. They also considered preventive war. But they had a number of dilemmas that they would encounter. First of all, if they engaged in airstrikes, it was not clear that these airstrikes would be particularly effective. Fordow was too deeply buried. There was also a point at which it would be too late. So once Iran had refined enough enough uranium to 90%, it would then be a very, very difficult question. So if you then try to engage in a preventive war or preventive attacks, at the point where Iran already has a nuclear weapon, it suddenly becomes a lot more risky. And there's a certain point at which you simply can't do enough to stop the program. Again, if you had engaged in airstrike, you probably could delay the program some, but you wouldn't be able to stop it, and you might only embolden Iran to try and push desperately to try and get the uranium refined as quickly as possible, because it could see its options running out. And then the other possibility was to think about accepting a nuclear Iran, and think about whether or not Iran could be deterred from attacking Israel, from destroying from destroying Israel, as some people thought it would do, from engaging in other forms of actions against other states such as Saudi Arabia. There was a whole set of questions about whether it would be possible to deter Iran, and also a whole lot of questions about whether, if Iran got nuclear weapons, would Saudi Arabia be next? Clearly, Saudi Arabia is a relatively rich state, which could probably do it pretty quickly. And then once Saudi goes nuclear, do other states go nuclear? And do we get this very, very unstable region of the world suddenly having a whole bunch of countries with nuclear weapons bristling at their borders, looking at each other and distrusting each other, and whether this would be a good or a bad thing? The eventual choice that was made by the United States, together with the European Union, and some grudging reluctance from Israel, but an acceptance that at least the United States was doing something, was sanctions and diplomacy. So the United States sanctions that I've already mentioned were introduced, together with diplomacy saying to Iran, if you came to the table, we will figure out a deal, but you need to get rid of your nuclear program. And this did indeed lead to an agreement called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, which was reached in July of 2015 by the Obama administration, with vociferous opposition from Republicans who claimed that this was selling out to an enemy of the United States and Israel. So back when the debates were happening, and there were the disagreements about what to do were very often shaped by the broader perceptions of proliferation that we have talked about already, in the broader theories of proliferation and non-proliferation. So we see, for example, how it is that Waltz, in the article that has been assigned, argued that we should allow Iran to have nuclear weapons, that this would be a good thing. And the first assumption that Waltz made pretty clearly is that Iran is a state and that states are rational. And when states are rational, they will not want to engage in nuclear war, and they will be less likely, if you are a Waltzian, you believe that they will be less likely to engage in other kinds of war because they will feel secure. Their fears about their security will have been largely, if not completely, calmed down, and hence you might expect that a nuclear Iran, according to Waltz, would be a more peaceful Iran. So Waltz is pushing back then against these arguments that Iran is an irrational power, that Iran is irrationally committed to the destruction of Israel no matter what, and instead he is saying that Iran is a rational state, it is led by rational leaders, and they will behave rationally, and they will behave more peacefully, according to Waltz, once they have nuclear weapons than they have in the past, because they will no longer they will no longer be trapped in a security dilemma. So he said that they could be readily deterred from attacking other states if they understand that attacking Israel will result in the United States obliterating them. They will not attack Israel. They will similarly not attack Saudi Arabia. They will also not be tempted to provide nuclear weapons to proxies. Iran, of course, has supported a number of proxy organizations in the region, such as Hezbollah, which have engaged in a variety of terrorist attacks. So one of the fears was that Iran would provide nuclear weapons to these actors, and that these actors could then use these nuclear weapons in ways that would be unpredictable, given that militias and terrorist organizations are not the same thing as states, that they would then be tempted to use them in an offensive fashion, and that this would have all of these negative consequences, obviously. And finally, Waltz made the provocative argument that the real problem, according to him, in Middle East peace was that there was one nuclear power, Israel, which was not being balanced against. And this led to all of this instability because other states feared Israel, because Israel had no real counter power to try to make it change its own calculations. So then, according to Waltz, if Israel found itself being confronted with another nuclear power in the region, we would see a more stable system emerge, a more stable system of balancing between Israel and Iran, and this would lead to much less volatility and much less likelihood of war. And he also claimed that there was no real danger of proliferation, that once Iran had gotten nuclear weapons, that other states would not be tempted. So this is a set of arguments which is pretty compatible with the realist theories that Waltz is adopting. He is saying that whether we like a state or whether we don't like a state doesn't matter if we're trying to think about whether that state will be rational, because it will be, because all states have to be rational, because otherwise bad things will happen to them, and that bipolarity plus nuclear weapons is a good solution to stability, that this will provide more stability, more predictability, and will allow states to align each other with the two nuclear powers in a way that makes for a much easier time for everybody concerned. This argument, however, got pushed back from Colin Kael, who was then recently left the Obama administration, and who was a senior official in the Pentagon, and he represented the Obama perspective, which was very, very different from the perspective of those who fundamentally distrusted Iran on the Republican side of the aisle, but nonetheless disagreed with some of Waltz's more sanguine predictions. So what he agreed with? He agreed that Iran's leaders were rational. He agreed that implicitly he suggested that a lot of the debate in the United States around Iran is overblown, that Iran is probably not going to engage in the kinds of severe kinds of attack, or crazy attacks in which they would attack Israel, knowing that they would be blown out of existence, but nonetheless calculating that this was what religion told them to do. Kael says this is not true. He says that Iran's leaders are rational. They are not going to do anything that is going to lead to their country potentially being destroyed. But he also suggests that a lot of the other things that Iran does might be, so might become worse. A lot of the problems that Iran contributes to might become worse rather than better if Iran has nuclear weapons. And the fundamental implicit argument he is making here is that the security dilemma for Iran is not the only thing that is driving Iran's behavior. That it is not simply behaving in these ways because it is fearful of being invaded. It is also behaving in these ways because it has interests that it can best pursue by causing instability in other countries in other parts of the region. And here, what Kale is suggesting is that Waltz is not paying enough attention to what is sometimes called the stability-instability paradox. And the argument behind this is as follows: that we can imagine that in some ways, nuclear proliferation might lead to greater stability on a global level, or on the level of massive conflagrations. That is that if states have nuclear weapons, that's going to mean that other states are less likely to launch wars, which could lead to the nuclear powers deploying their nuclear weapons. So we are less likely to see the kinds of the big wars that we saw in World War I and World War II that occupied much of the world. And we're also less likely to see regional conflagrations in which lots of states get involved, because there's always going to be a greater interest in stopping before it gets to that point. So on this macro level, we might expect to see increased stability. But there's another level of actions that states can take, which might involve minor wars, might involve provocations, might involve the sponsoring of terrorist groups or of militias, might involve trying to destabilize neighboring states such as Lebanon. All of these things, we might imagine that nuclear-powered states might be more willing to engage in once they have nuclear weapons than before, because nobody can stop them from doing it, because other states are going to prefer to just sort of live with the things that the nuclear state is doing rather than to attack it. So this means that even while there is stability at the level of big wars, at the level of minor incursions, at the level of terrorism, at the level of various forms of subversion, various forms of covert action, all of these things, we might expect that there might be increased instability at this level rather than stability. So that you get the stability-instability paradox, where there's less likelihood of wars that might cross the nuclear threshold, but lots more instability below those big wars, lots more likelihood of other actions, other mischief, other forms of retaliation, using proxy powers, all of these things below that threshold. And so you can think about this, for example, as having happened during the Cold War, that the United States and the Soviet Union never went to war with each other, but they engaged in a lot of actions below that. So that, for example, the United States, it provided a lot of arms and other goodies to groups in Afghanistan who are seeking to destabilize the Soviet favoring regime of Nazarbayev in Afghanistan. It funded all of these mujahideen who sought to destabilize that regime. It provided them with sophisticated weapons of one sort or another, and it did so effectively, so knowing that if it restrained its actions beneath a certain threshold, that there was no likelihood of war happening, but that it nonetheless might be able to make life uncomfortable and unhappy for an adversary by effectively having these proxy guerrillas fighting on its behalf. And of course, these proxy guerrillas led to a lot of problems because one of the major leaders was Osama bin Laden, but that is a different. So the eventual outcome of the Iran situation was, as I say, the JCPOA, which was a deal that was made between Iran and the P5+1, which was a set of major powers, plus the European Union, which played a significant role in this as an independent state, in addition to member states such as France and the United Kingdom. So the Iranian nuclear deal effectively involved a number of timelines of 10 or 15 years, which were intended to restrain Iran from doing stuff which would lead to nuclear breakout. So the Arak reactor was supposed to be redesigned so that it would not be able to produce large amounts of plutonium. And its spent fuel, the fuel that could be used, could be processed to produce plutonium, would be shipped out of the country to be processed there. Iran would still perhaps be able to use very limited amounts of plutonium for medical purposes, but not nearly enough to create nuclear weapons from them. And after 15 years, the ban on heavy water reactors and reprocessing would become a voluntary ban, so that at this point, presumably, perhaps Iran will go back to the negotiating table or whatever, but it only agreed to the ban for 15 years. Uranium. Iran agreed to dismantle most of the centrifuges that it had, and not to have more sophisticated centrifuges. This was estimated to substantially reduce the breakout time, make it far more difficult for Iran to create a nuclear weapon at short notice, giving roughly a year's warning. And research on new centrifuge technology was constrained. Iran had gotten its initial centrifuges from a Pakistani scientist who more or less sold the designs on the black market, and the stockpiles of uranium were limited, so that low enriched uranium was limited to 300 kilograms. And no highly enriched uranium was allowed. But again, these constraints were supposed to disappear after 15 years, at which point the presumed hope was on both sides that there would be that Iran would have perhaps become more integrated into the world political system, and that hostilities might have been abated. And in exchange for this, Iran got relief from all of the sanctions which were severely damaging its economy. So this was also supposed to be monitored in a variety of ways. So Iran agreed to inspections with the International Atomic Energy Agency under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and agreed to accept an additional protocol to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which introduced further inspection and constraints, and allowed short notice access in particular to declared sites, so that if somebody under some conditions to other locations, so that it would become easier for the International Atomic Energy Agency to have a short notice inspection to make sure that Iran was not doing bad stuff behind people's backs. There was daily access to certain facilities for the International Atomic Energy Agency, various monitoring technologies, other things which were supposed to make it extremely difficult for Iran to engage in an undetected nuclear program, and to provide the rest of the world with a high degree of visibility as to what Iran was expected to do. And in addition to the formal provisions for inspection by an international organization, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which does this stuff, there was also going to be an important role. National intelligence agencies could effectively, probably by using satellite or remote sensing, by using human intelligence, would probably have a reasonably good likelihood of figuring out where there were undeclared facilities, albeit without any 100% guarantees. One of the reasons why Iraq the Second Iraq War happened was that there was that people in the First Iraq War, they hadn't realized how far Iraq had gotten towards producing a nuclear weapon without being detected by the rest of the world, which is one of the reasons, albeit far from the only reason, why there was so much suspicion of Iraq in the lead up to the Second Iraq War, was because Iraq had been able to do all sorts of stuff in secret without being detected in a previous era. And so again, when you talk about undeclared facilities, it is likely that it will be possible for other countries' intelligence agencies to detect it, but there are no guarantees, and there is a worry that undetected stuff could happen. What happened then? Well, obviously then in November 2016, Trump was elected, and in January 2017, he became the president. And Trump responded to a very wide degree of distrust among conservatives in the agreement with Iran. And this trust among conservatives, it centred on two things. First of all, it centred on claims that a better deal was possible and that the existing deal that Iran had agreed to was grossly inadequate. That this deal would not prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons in the longer term or even the medium term, and that in the short term it was possible that Iran could use this to continue sneaking around and to create perhaps an undeclared nuclear facility, and that it would be much more possible for Iran to do all of this stuff once the sanctions were released, because then Iran, once it began to integrate into the world economy, it would be able to effectively, it would get lots more money, it would be able to sell its oil on international markets at regular prices, and it would be able to engage in international commerce, and it would have much more resources that it could pour into a potential clandestine nuclear program. So this was one set of arguments. The second set of arguments was that the deal made no provisions that required Iran to stop behaving in a variety of other ways that were problematic. So that, for example, it did not require Iran to start sort of favoring diplomatic relations with U.S. allies such as Israel. It also did not require Iran to stop using proxy actors and supporting proxy actors such as Hezbollah that mounted attacks on Israel and on US facilities. It didn't do anything to restrain Iranian influence on various groups within Iraq. And so there was a perception, so that among Republicans, that Iran was continuing to be able to behave in a variety of bad ways for the United States, and that the United States had not sought to restrain Iran even while reaching a formal agreement with Iran on the nuclear program. So all of this together went into creating a lot of Republican arguments against the deal, and once Trump was elected, he indeed began to go around about dismantling the deal pretty quickly and withdrew from the JCPOA as soon as he possibly could. After the JCPOA, after the United States withdrew, the other countries that were in the and entities that were in the JCPOA continued to stay in it to try and hopefully they hoped to keep Iran from ramping up its nuclear program again. But the United States reimposed a variety of sanctions against Iran, and it had a snapback. It used these sanctions to try and force its allies to disengage from the Iranian economy as well. And it went on what was called a so-called maximum pressure policy, which was intended to squeeze Iran further and further and further, with more and more sanctions being used against it and more actions against Iran. Now, one of the problems with this, as we'll remember if we go back to the week on sanctions, is that sanctions are by and large most effective when there is a clear demand that they are making. That is, that if you do this thing, you will have sanctions removed from you. And then this provides the sanctioned entity with a clear path to removing sanctions by stopping behaving in some behavior that you don't want. But the United States was at the very best ambiguous in its desires towards Iran. On the one hand, it talked about the behaviors that Iran was engaging in that it didn't want. On the other hand, it also claimed that Iran was doing stuff that it plausibly was not doing in the nuclear program. So claiming that Iran had revamped its nuclear program when it really had not. And finally, there was a very strong suspicion that the administration probably wanted not just to get Iran to behave better, but it wanted to remove the regime in power. It wanted to use the sanctions to undermine and destabilize the regime, and this meant, of course, that the regime had no incentive to make concessions to a foreign entity from its perspective that was doing everything that it could to destroy it. So Iran has partly, but not completely, withdrawn from the deal, has begun some further enrichment activities, and we're now seeing we're seeing some new politics beginning to emerge. So that Iran has been particularly hard hit by the coronavirus, which has led to a lot of unhappiness both among some people in the United States and among the US allies in Europe, with the way in which the sanctions are making it extremely difficult to get medical and humanitarian supplies to Iran. In theory, it's supposed to be possible to get these supplies. In practice, it turns out to be extremely difficult. And this morning, the morning that the lecture has been given, it was announced that a special European scheme for allowing trade with Iran under certain limited and specific circumstances has been used for the very first time in order to get medical supplies to Iran. This is an important step because the United States has indicated in the past that it is hostile towards this scheme, that it sees this scheme as being a means to try and work around US sanctions, which indeed it is. And so how the United States responds to this is going to have some important consequences. So that's the story of Iran. And we see here that the different takes on what to do with Iran have a lot to do. They have a lot, in order to understand this, you first of all have to understand the technical details of how it is that nuclear weapons are produced. In order to understand the different attitudes the different actors have taken, you want to understand which perspectives they're coming from. So that if you are a realist of one sort or another, you think of Iran as being one kind of threat. You think about it as being perhaps a threat to other countries in the region, depending upon your views on the stability-instability paradox. But you also don't think that Iran is going to do anything super threatening, such as attacking Iran or attacking Israel with nuclear weapons, because you believe that this would perhaps lead to Iran being destroyed, and Iran, being a rational state, doesn't want to do this. If instead you think that Iran is led by irrational leaders, as many people on the Republican side of the aisle seem to do, you'd come to a very different set of conclusions about the kind of threat that Iran poses to the United States and to US. North Korea is a different threat, and this is what we will wrap up with. Because North Korea, in contrast to Iran, already has nuclear weapons and already has systems for delivering those nuclear weapons. It has conducted 6 nuclear tests so far, steadily improving the yield from its weapons. And the most recent test was in September 2017. It was either a boosted atomic explosion, that is a standard uranium-based device which was boosted in some way, or else it was a thermonuclear explosion based upon sort of a hydrogen bomb, and it was somewhere in the 70 to 280 kiloton range. And just last Sunday, just a couple of days ago, it fired 2 ballistic missiles into the sea, testing the delivery systems that it would use against the United States or another potential adversary. At best, as we can tell, it has somewhere between 20 to 60 nuclear weapons. It's tested missiles that can reach the west coast of the United States, but it's not clear that these missiles could reach the United States with a warhead, whether they are big enough to contain a warhead, and it's not clear that they would successfully be able to deliver the attack, that they might burn up on re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere. So those are... it is still nonetheless a sufficiently credible threat that it has US policymakers very, very nervous. And the major threat, however, is not against the United States. The United States is coming under increased threat thanks to the ability of North Korea to develop ballistic missiles. But the real and immediate threat is against Seoul, because it has extensive artillery capabilities. Seoul is very close to the border with North Korea, and in the situation that hostilities broke out, it will be possible for the North Koreans to use conventional artillery means of delivering sort of a massive attack against Seoul, which also could include chemical attacks. We believe that North Korea, there is substantial reason to believe that North Korea has a pretty large stockpile of a variety of chemical weapons, and also there are some intelligence analysts who believe that North Korea also has a significant biological arsenal as well. So this is a real threat. It is a crucial threat to a significant US ally in the region, and it is a plausible threat to the United States of America, to the western seaboard of the United States of America too. Again, however, the options are not particularly wonderful. Preventive war is one option, but if one engaged in preventive war with North Korea, one would take two risks. One would be that North Korea was indeed capable of using ballistic missiles to mount a nuclear attack on the United States, which it is possibly able to do, albeit not certainly. And the other would be that that North Korea could very quickly mount an extremely devastating attack against Seoul and against South Korea, and possibly also attack Japan pretty straightforwardly too. So the costs of a preventive war would be extremely high. Stronger sanctions. The United States has applied a variety of sanctions against North Korea over the year to coerce concessions. Those sanctions have not been particularly successful in producing major changes in North Korean policy. China provides a lot of support for North Korea. Perhaps it will be possible to get China to disengage to some degree from supporting North Korea, which is a troublesome satellite state from China's perspective. And this is something that the Obama and Trump administration have both pursued with some degree of success, but not really much success in getting North Korea to change its behavior. Diplomacy. This is what Trump has done, with a variety of threats of military strikes, and a summit that was held in June 2018 with a joint statement pledging complete denuclearization of the area, which is which is problematic in some ways from the point of view of previous US doctrine, but nonetheless, this was what the joint statement pledged. Nonetheless, there's been relatively little progress on a deal that had been made in the intervening year and 9 months. And North Korea, as I say, it is continuing to test missiles and is believed to be producing continued fissile material in the meantime. And finally, one can also look to deterrence, and one can hope that that North Korea is a rational state, that it realizes that if it were to attack South Korea, if it were to attack another state, that it would find itself in a situation where its entire existence might be questionable, that it might be subjected to a massive nuclear counter-retaliation. So there are, however, important differences between Iran and North Korea. Obviously, North Korea has nuclear weapons and intercontinental range delivery systems that it may be able to use to deliver nuclear warheads to some parts of the United States, and it has conventional and other capabilities against South Korea. This makes it a far greater threat than Iran, at least in the short to medium term. It already has nukes, and it is very, very difficult to, that means that it is very difficult to mount certain kinds of attacks, certain kinds of retaliation against North Korea without getting into a nuclear war. It's also extremely difficult to maintain international cooperation against North Korea because North Korea has the support of a major power. It has the support of China. This means that even things at the UN Security Council, it's hard to get them past a Chinese veto unless they are relatively anodyne. China has its own problems with North Korea, but nonetheless has been prepared to maintain North Korea and protect North Korea against major retaliation. And finally, sanctions may put less pressure on the North Korean elite than sanctions against Iran, because Iran is a country which aspires to becoming part of the global economy, which aspires to, which would, in its ideal world, would be able to import and export relatively straightforwardly, whereas North Korea has pursued a policy of self-reliance, which has produced intense impoverishment of ordinary North Korean people, but which has at the same time meant that the North Korean economy is much more robust against international sanctions than is the South Korean, especially given the major role that North Korea, that China plays in North Korea's trading relationships. Interesting questions about the relationship between North Korea and Iran. One question is about rationality. In some ways, the North Korean regime appears on its face to be less rational and more in pursuit of highly ideological motivations than is Iran. where there have been at least some possibilities for moderates to be elected for periods of time. It's hard to say whether this is a real difference or just a superficial difference, so that it could be, for example, that a lot of the North Korean rhetoric is no more than rhetoric, and that its leaders are as committed to self-preservation as anybody else. There are also questions about the stability-instability paradox, which is that in Iran, we very, very clearly see that it is capable of making a variety of forms of regional mischief because of its support of various militias and terrorist organizations, whereas North Korea has certainly been prepared to behave in a variety of awful ways, including cyber attacks of one sort or another, but has not been nearly as engaged in terrorist activities or supporting terrorist activities as Iran has been in the past. So that it's interesting to ask the question of whether whether North Korea is perhaps because of circumstances, perhaps because of regional interests, is less interested in playing those kinds of games, albeit obviously North Korea has engaged in various forms of subversive activities vis-a-vis South Korea. And finally, there's an important question which applies to both of them. And this is a point that James Fearon, who's a famous international relations professor, has made with regard to North Korea, but that is also true to some extent, perhaps to a lesser degree, depending on the administration, with respect to Iran, which is that the United States, if it makes commitments to North Korea has no real reason to believe that those commitments will extend any further than self-interest makes absolutely necessary. So that, for example, if the United States agreed that in the future it supported the existence and would recognize the North Korean regime diplomatically in ways that it has not to date, and that it believes that North Korea ought to remain in existence, that the regime was a legitimate regime, it's plausible that North Korea would not believe these kinds of representations as really representing what the US believed, because the US it does view North Korea as being a regime that it is fundamentally hostile to. It does view North Korea as a regime that the world would be better off without. And if there were a quick and straightforward and non-risky way for the United States to somehow depose or topple the regime, it probably would do that. This may or may not be true depending on your interpretation of US politics of the US vis-a-vis Iran. So it's pretty clear that the Obama administration was committed to some degree to building a working relationship with Iran and to recognizing the Iranian regime, likely in the hope and in the belief that over time the aspects of the Iranian regime, which allowed for some degree of popular election or whatever, might lead to a move from a religious theocracy into a regime which had less directly opposed interests to the United States. And furthermore, the Obama administration believed that in some ways the Iranian regime, it wanted to build better relations with the Iranian regime to hedge against its relationships with the Saudi Arabian regime, which it perceived as being potentially untrustworthy and potentially unstable. We now see that the Trump administration has a very different perspective. The Trump administration's perspective is that the Iranian regime is inherently untrustworthy. There's good reason to believe that the administration and many people in the Republican Party would like to see the Iranian regime removed, however possible. And so this then means that Iran, when it looks to commitments that the United States makes in future, has to make a series of calculations. It has to decide, first of all, is the commitment of those within the United States who say that they are committed to a long-term deal with Iran, it has to decide, are those commitments genuine, or are those commitments superficial? Will they disappear under more difficult conditions? And secondly, it has to decide what is the likelihood that the administration administration will shift to an administration that is actively hostile to its interests, and whether or not this means that any deal that Iran does with the United States is going to be maintainable. So one interesting and important question here is that United States tends to see things from a quite US-centric role and tends to view think in terms of the trustworthiness or the untrustworthiness of other regimes, and tends to think about itself as being a reliable actor. But from the point of view of other states, it may be that this is not so, and this may be because states such as North Korea perceive correctly that the United States fundamentally finds their entire way of being viscerally appalling, even apart from the strategic questions of the threat that the North Korean regime poses to the US or to US allies, and the North Korean regime therefore credibly, plausibly doesn't trust the United States, which means that there may be limits to the kinds of deal that can be done. And for Iran and for other countries like Iran, it becomes a much more complex set of calculations, which have to do with the fact that attitudes towards Iran have become to some extent a partisan issue, leading to some degree of unpredictability for Iran in US behavior in the future, even apart from any broader distrust that it might have of United States intentions. So these are important questions, which in a sense get us back to the questions that Schelling asked originally about credibility and about US credibility and the important role that it plays. And here we see that it not only plays an important role with respect to the kinds of issues of deterrence that Schelling was interested in, but also it plays an important role in diplomacy and the profound domestic disagreements within the United States about key foreign policy issues may mean that its ability to be credible towards a variety of foreign actors, including actors with whom its relations are less hostile than the relationship with Iran, that its credibility may be called into increased doubt, to the extent that we see greater differences between different administrations, reflecting polarization of foreign policy to a greater extent than has been true in the past. So this is where I will finish. Thank you.